Hi and welcome back to the channel. Let's move on with the second half of the 1960s, 1 year at a time, one movie per year. The four criteria I've got for these movies are pretty simple. They have to be released in the year mentioned, they have to be part of the style and the zeitgeist of the 1960s, they have to have a modern contemporary setting, and they have to be worth checking out. I was tempted to go with a different tranche of movies for part 2. Really quality movies like Beach Blanket Bingo, Skidoo, The Valley of the Dolls, The Astro Zombies, and They Saved Hitler's Brain. But I can always do those in future videos, so let's get back on track and start with the movie for 1965. Warren Beatty has always been a bit of an odd actor. He's kind of like a lightly roasted, more talented version of George Hamilton. His movie persona during the 1960s was a romantic leading man, slightly quirky but fairly mainstream. In the 1970s, with movies like Shampoo, that changed, but in Arthur Penn's 1965 Mickey 1, Beatty's toothy earnestness is put to good use. In this one, he plays a nightclub comedian whose real name we never learn, who is living the high life. He's drinking, he's gambling, he's having an affair with a beautiful woman, played by Playboy Playmate of the Year for 1964, Donna Michelle, and in general he's acting like a one-man rat pack. The mobsters who run the club suddenly tell him that he owes them big. Their mouthpiece, played by Franchot Tone, lays it out for him. He's in debt for an amount never stated, and he's to work for them forever, with $20 a week for himself. The comedian flees Detroit, he burns his ID, hops a freight and ends up in Chicago living in hobo jungles until he finds a social security card from a guy who has just been mugged, and he becomes Miklos Wunjeva, also known as Mickey 1. At first he works as a dishwasher until almost by accident he gets a gig at a small strip club as the MC. A larger club owner and his manager, played by Herb Hatfield and Jeff Corey, entice Mickey to play their club, but he's terrified of being identified. And as he starts a new relationship with a woman called Jenny, played by Alexandra Stewart, he's forced to confront his past. Mickey 1 is filled with surrealistic scenes, visual symbolism, and an interesting directorial inventiveness. It plays like a French New Wave film in some ways. In the 1960s, Mickey 1 was seen as being pretentious, but in more recent years has been re-evaluated. Personally, I love the kookiness of interesting things that keep happening in this movie, like the Japanese visual artist that Mickey keeps seeing in Chicago, and how that impish character played by a Kurosawa favourite, Kamatari Fujiwara, leads to one of the weirdest and most wonderful scenes in the movie. Fujiwara, by the way, played one of the two bumpkin villagers in the Hidden Fortress. He was the guy upon whom George Lucas based R2-D2. I kid you not. So what is Mickey 1 actually about? It's part Kafkaesque nightmare, part fever dream. It's a critique and deconstruction of the suave hipster world of 1950s entertainment. It criticises the facile smoothness of Sinatra's Rat Pack and the mob in Las Vegas and all of those things that made an enormous machine for extracting money from the punters. It's so many different things, this movie. To describe too many of the outrageous scenes in this film is to spoil it. For me, Mickey 1 is Hollywood clearing away the trash of the 50s to make way for the 60s. The producer of the film, Harrison Starr, described the protagonist of the film as an eccentric, a person whose inner demons were reflected in the world he inhabited. And that's pretty accurate. This is not a straightforward narrative. It's surrealistic. It doesn't go in the directions you think it's going to go. And that makes it a really interesting piece of cinema. The director Arthur Penn and Warren Beatty worked together again 2 years later in a small, now-forgotten film called Bonnie and Clyde.
We're a weird mob, that is what they say.
I had to throw in an Australian film, even though there weren't many of them made in the 1960s. This one's based on John O'Grady's 1957 novel of the same name, and the movie tells the story of an Italian sports journalist, Nino Collotta, played by Walter Chiari, who comes to Sydney to work for an Italian-language magazine his cousin is publishing. When he gets to Australia, he finds culture shock, and he also finds that his cousin has closed the magazine and disappeared, leaving a large debt to a woman called Kay Kelly, played by Claire Dunn. Nino, being an honourable man, promises to get a job and pay her the money back, which he does. He gets a job as a builder's labourer with Ed Devereaux's Joe and his mob of clownish, hard-drinking workers. At first, Nino is seen as an outsider, which of course he is, but everybody soon realises that he's a hard worker and he's an honest man and teach him the quirky ways of Australian culture 1960 style. They're a Weird Mob was directed and produced by Michael Powell, who gave us some of the best British films of the 40s and 50s, before a creepy and much criticised horror movie called Peeping Tom totally killed his career in the UK. While this one's not up to Powell's earlier input, The Weird Mob is a lively, broad pastiche of Australian urban life. It did make a lot of money here too, which led to the film renaissance of the 1970s and the most beloved of Australian genres, Ozploitation. More importantly, it shows the changes in attitudes to migration from non-English speaking nations that Australia was undergoing at the time. Post-war continental European migrants generated a lot of xenophobia here. I remember a lot of it from my childhood. It is still here, but fortunately it's dwindling. There are a lot of cringy attitudes in this movie, but there's also a strong thread of Australian egalitarianism. We also get a call for multiculturalism well before the M-word became part of mainstream political discourse in this country. And yes, the movie is a naive, optimistic work, but it's also slyly subversive. In the 1960s, The Weird Mob flipped the widely held local narrative to say that white Australian culture was weird and not the beliefs of other people. And I can't really argue against that idea. Few American actors in the 1960s were as cool as James Coburn. That lanky, toothy man was more intellectual than Steve McQueen. He was warmer than Lee Marvin. He's less menacing than Charles Bronson and less reliant on the mythologies of the past than Clint Eastwood. It's a toss-up whether the two Derek Flint movies or this insane satire of the American status quo are the point at which the 1960s reached peak Coburn cool. But for my money, The President's Analyst takes the cake. Coburn plays Sidney Shaffer, an urbane psychiatrist living in New York City. He has a beautiful girlfriend, Nan, a thriving practice, and an interesting patient called Don, played by Godfrey Cambridge, who is actually an assassin for the Central Inquiries Agency, the CEA, who's been sent to vet Sidney for a new job to become the analyst for the President of the United States. The CEA is in conflict with the entirely male Federal Bureau of Regulation, as Sidney takes on the job and finds the stress of helping POTUS with his stresses at any time of the day or night difficult. The lack of sleep and the information he has makes him edgy and paranoid, and rightly so because he has everything to be paranoid about. Add to that the problems of every intelligence agency in the world suddenly wanting to kidnap Sidney for the secrets he now holds, and you have a sharp, sarcastic satire of Cold War paranoia, American exceptionalism, and popular culture, even the Beatles. There's a mop-top pop group called the Pudlians who are actually working for the Canadian Secret Service in this film. The supporting cast is inspired. Godfrey Cambridge, who died tragically early at the age of 43, has a mesmerising monologue as Don in one of his therapy sessions with Sidney. The monologue is only strengthened by a sudden pivot it makes at the end. We also get Seven Darden, who almost steals the movie as the Russian agent Kropotkin, who becomes one of Sidney's patients as well. Eventually we do find out which organisation is the real threat to humanity, and the movie takes one more satirical stab at happily ever after Christmas films. This was the first movie greenlit by Robert Evans when he took over at Paramount Pictures in the 1960s. It was financially unsuccessful, but it gained a cult status over the following 54 years. Indicator have just put out a new Blu-ray edition which looks great and has some really helpful extras. And one final observation. The only people in the movie without an agenda or hostile intentions are the hippies. 1967 was also the summer of love. With a title that sounds like a lost Elia Kazan movie, This 1968 political film is hysterically funny to a modern audience. It's about mainstream America's paranoia about and hatred for youth culture. Christopher Jones plays a sociopath called Max Frost, the lead singer of a band called The Troopers, which include a 15-year-old genius lawyer, an ex-child actor, an amputee horn player played by Larry Bishop, and Richard Pryor on drums. The movie has some really crazy scenes. It starts out with a weird montage of Max's early life from conception with his toxic, neurotic and violent mother played by Shelley Winters, and which ends up with the teenage Max making LSD in the basement of their house and stockpiling dynamite, which he uses to blow up his father's new Chrysler. The next thing, the band forms and Max is a pop star. The band is interestingly introduced by a disgusted sounding voiceover by Paul Frees. An ambitious Senate candidate, Johnny Fergus, played by Hal Holbrook, gets the band to play at one of his rallies. Max flips the narrative and improvises a song about reducing the voting age to 14. The idea goes viral, and the band does kind of compromise to lower the voting age to 15. Max's girlfriend becomes a congressperson, and eventually Max ends up president of the United States. This movie has a mad hatred of youth. Max has a horde of bastard children, his mother's a grotesque human being, and he ends up putting everyone over 35 into re-education camps and dosing them with LSD. And there are some aspects of President Max that are not entirely dissimilar to certain aspects of a recent real-life American president. The pop music by Les Baxter and Mike Kerb, among other people, is good, with political pop songs which are presented well in concert footage, and that really helps sell this kind of absurd premise. At the time it came out, Wild in the Streets was compared with the Peter Watkins film Privilege by Roger Ebert, and it's interesting to compare and contrast the two. In Privilege, the wealthy elites weaponize pop music and pop culture for their own authoritarian ends. In Wild in the Streets, pop culture becomes authoritarian. For my money, Privilege is a better film, but Wild in the Streets has that insane 1960s American zeitgeist. It is really a one-off and really a strange piece of 1960s cinema. 1969 has to be Easy Rider. As a 12-year-old, way before I ever saw the movie, I had that poster of Wyatt and Billy on their bikes riding down the highway on my bedroom wall. The other poster I had was the Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, because that's how I rolled. The story of two free spirits doing a drug deal to finance their quest for a better life in Florida, then riding across America on their bikes towards their ultimate destiny, is a piece of cinema history. The solid soundtrack, including Steppenwolf's Born to be Wild, beautiful cinematography from Laszlo Kovacs, and a breakout role by Jack Nicholson as George Hansen, an alcoholic lawyer who helps the boys and joins their quest to find America. Like all good road movies, Easy Rider is part documentary. The towns and villages and hippie communes Billy and Wyatt travel through are authentic, and Hopper as director picked up on the suspicion and hatred of counterculture expressed by the locals across the South. Some of the faces we see in this movie are full of hatred, suspicion and disdain. Though I personally think that Wyatt and Billy were stupid for dropping acid in a cemetery, their idealism and their strange innocence has always made me love this film. It contrasts the two tides that pull at human hearts and societies: the yearning for a better life and the hatred for those who are different. As a species, we're halfway between apes and angels. These tides are always with us, but it was in the 1960s that we really defined them in cinematic terms. I can rewatch Easy Rider 2 or 3 times a year and still get something new from it. It's always good when a movie now and then reminds you about idealism. I first became aware of Helen Mirren when I saw Michael Powell's Age of Consent on television at a very vulnerable age. Her fine acting as Cora, the nature child muse of James Mason's artist Brad, was not the first thing I thought of when I saw that movie. Mirren was trained by the National Youth Theatre and the Royal Shakespeare Company. She's given us an enormous range of characters in cinema, from Caesonia in Caligula, Harold Shan's girlfriend Victoria in The Long Good Friday, Morgana in Excalibur, Georgina in The Cook, the Thief, His Wife and Her Lover, Beatty in Hussey, Elizabeth Windsor in The Queen, and Betty McLeish in The Good Liar, she has refined her craft with age and given us a diversity of roles over the 50-odd years she's been on the screen that few actors can equal. Helen Mirren also has that magical gift of being really good in really shitty movies. Teaching Mrs. Tingle, Red and Red 2, Hobbs and Shaw, and worst of all, the fiendish plot of Dr. Fu Manchu. She was the MVP in any bad movie she appeared in. Every time I've ever seen her on the screen, she's been incredibly watchable. And I'll leave you with a couple of Mirren facts. In the early 1980s, she lived with Liam Neeson.
Starring the incomparable Liam Neeson.
And she is a nudist. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please consider subscribing, giving this video a thumbs up, and hitting the notification bell. You can also sponsor the channel at patreon.com/paleocinema. And as always, watch some good 60s movies. Watch some bad 60s movies. You'll find a lot of those. Enjoy yourself. Take care of yourself. And I'll catch you next time.